This episode is brought to you by LaFosse Academy, a program dedicated to helping people from diverse backgrounds break into the tech industry. They don't just train you with the skills you need, they help you to land your first role, give you real-world experience and a strong foundation to launch your career in tech. For businesses, the Academy offers a way to build diverse, future-ready teams while creating opportunities for talented individuals who might not have had a traditional route into tech. So, whether you're looking to start a career in tech or you're a business leader ready to build a stronger, more diverse team, speak to LaFosse Academy and take the next step. At Elevate Colour, we're proud to share their mission to level the playing field and create a tech workforce that truly reflects society. Hi everyone, welcome back to Race to the Top with me, Okilazu. In today's episode, we'll be talking to Frank Starling. It's a really, really good conversation and it's very wide-ranging and we cover things such as celebrating creativity, having his school uniform that came from Oxfam, how he leans into fear, how he's developed a skill of being able to tell the thickness of paper from just touching it, and how he deals with his own imposter syndrome. I found it an incredibly enlightening conversation, and I'm sure you will too. Let's get into this. Welcome.
Thanks, Oki. Good to see you.
And you. What is Cannes Lions? You know, we met when you were at Variety Pack. You went off to do Cannes Lions. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Yeah.
Just to educate me and our listeners.
So Cannes Lions is essentially a festival of creativity. So we celebrate creativity. We've been doing that for over 70 years now. Sometimes people confuse it with the film festival.
I think I did.
Right.
And loads of marketing people, I was at something and loads of people said, we're all off to Cannes. Is that the same thing?
So that would be our festival, I would say. So you've got the Cannes Film Festival. And born out of that was the Cannes International Festival of Creativity. So that happened, it was started 71 years ago.
All right.
And what we celebrate is marketing, brand communications, creativity as a whole. So we host the festival during mid-June in the south of France. And you can expect to experience things like networking, learning. Yeah. We've got an amazing awards ceremony.
Yes.
All of that good stuff. We've got over 300 organizations and brands that show up, nearly 15,000 delegates. So you should come. It's quite the festival.
I'll take that as an invite. I'll take that 100% as an invite. And it's recorded. It's on tape that you invited me. It would be. But the people who go, it's incredible. So I was doing a marketing event in London, and then literally everyone was like, "We're all off to Cannes," and I thought, they must be going off to that sort of thing. So is the whole year for you and the organisation focused on that festival?
It's certainly a big part of what we do. I oversee the marketing divisions. I also oversee our brands, Walk, Contagious, and Acuity. And we have a combination of different things we do. So festivals and events is a big component, but we also have advisory and intelligence services. Yeah. So different teams focus on different things, but certainly Cannes Lions is a big part of the year and a big focus, obviously, for many of our team members for sure.
And we normally do this in the bit of career, but we're here now. So what attracted you to doing that job? Because you ran an amazing business where we first met, Variety Pack. What attracted you? What made you think this is big enough, or it has an impact for me doing what I was doing before?
Well, two things. I love creativity. I mean, I love the ability that we can dream up stuff and make it real.
Yeah.
But secondly, Lions has a really unique platform. Mm-hmm. The Cannes Lions Festival isn't just a festival, it's more than that. It's adored by many thousands in the industry. But I felt like that was quite a unique opportunity to drive collaboration. How can we create a more equitable society? What could that look like? So really leveraging our platform to be able to put that conversation right at the center of what we do. I report to our CEO, Simon Cook. Mm-hmm. So that's quite unique because I think many practitioners in my space would maybe report into an HR department.
Yes.
I think that gives me an opportunity to really look at, as a horizontal, how can we embed the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our business, but also what does that look like in terms of driving change and impact globally. So that was really attractive to me and led to that journey.
Yeah, and one of the benefits that's quoted often, and very much so in the McKinsey study on diversity and diverse teams, is that diverse teams are more creative and more innovative. Is that something you lean into, focus on, or can prove as part of Cannes Lions on the work that you do?
Definitely, it's something that we look at in terms of how we celebrate work. We ask data in terms of award entries. We ask for certain elements around diversity and inclusion, which is relevant. We know that when DE&I is embedded in the work, the outcomes are always better. But bigger than that, I mean, that McKinsey study's been done 4 times now, and it proves the effectiveness of embedding the principles of diversity and inclusion in any organization. But I think there are so many different aspects of DE&I that we don't necessarily talk about, which I think we can obviously get into today.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, okay, thank you. Great. So we normally talk about 3 things: you, your work, and the work. I always put it.
Nice.
So let's start at the beginning with you. You grew up in London, right?
I did.
Okay.
East London.
East
Hackney.
London. Hackney?
Hackney.
Oh, I think you're the 2nd or 3rd person at Hackney who's come through this way representing Hackney.
That's how we do.
Yeah. That's how Hackney rolls. Actually, it was interesting the last time we discussed it because Hackney is a very different place today than it was probably when you were growing up.
Oh, yeah.
You're with the gentrification. So what was it like growing up in Hackney in London?
Well, there were lots of families and it was very community orientated, but against the backdrop of a lot of disorder. Hackney was a borough that I think if you told people you lived in Hackney during those years, people would probably feel sorry for you in some way. I didn't see it as that. I mean, all I saw as a child growing up was my family, which was my mum and my sister, and the communities around me on a council estate in the east of London. So you're somewhat oblivious to a lot happening. But as I got older, all of those things became a lot more pronounced. That actually there's danger around here, and there are people doing things which are quite scary as a child to see. I remember
you were aware of that. So what sort of age would you become aware of that? Because when you're young, you don't see that. You just think, I'm in an environment. This is the environment I came up with. I'm just used to it.
Yeah.
So when did you start becoming aware of the sort of dangers or the perils of living in that sort of environment?
I think one of the first instances was when I saw my mum come down. She came out of our flat, went downstairs, and had to protect my sister from an engagement. There was a man who was being very aggressive with her. My mum had to literally come out and said, "Step away from my daughter."
Right.
And that was one of many instances where I realized that actually, look, this is, there's a lot happening here that I need to be aware of. And my mum was very protective of us growing up because of those reasons. She was a single parent.
Yep.
Bringing up 2 kids, that's a tough environment.
Yeah.
So your first port of call is, I need to protect my kids.
Yeah.
Basically. And she did to great success.
What sort of age would that have been?
So I would have been about 6 or 7 years old when that happened. So yeah, quite some time ago.
And did you start to try and make sense of the world, the environment you're in at that point? You talked about, hang on, there's other stuff going on around here.
Yeah, I guess in a sense, I think I was just looking to my mother for guidance, looking to my sister for guidance, and lived in a bit of a bubble, essentially. I went to primary school, came home. But then there were certain instances, domestic violence was another one for my mother. It's just seeing her experience domestic violence and seeing her around violent men was another instance where I realized, wow, this is scary stuff. Right?
Yeah.
Really scary stuff.
And I'm presuming, I don't know, that wasn't necessarily unusual in the environment that would have been back then.
It's hard to say. I think many families wouldn't necessarily share the stories of what was happening behind closed doors.
Yeah, that's true.
All I knew was what was happening within my household, and my father, who I've never met, was a very violent man.
Right.
And I think my mother probably felt that she'd escaped all of that violence, and yet it cropped up time and time again, various points of the journey that she had to navigate herself, which was obviously quite challenging, as you can imagine.
So, okay, so you're in Hackney. It is the way Hackney. I'm from Balham, South London. It's very similar at the time. What was it like at school? How was your schooling? How's your school life?
My primary school was very welcoming. I've got really fond memories of my primary school. Just, friends there. There are still one particular friend I've known for most of my life who, I consider to be one of my best friends. I actually went to secondary school in Victoria, so close to Westminster.
Right in London.
My mother was literally working in the area at the time, and through clearance managed to get me into a school in Victoria.
Yeah.
And that was a real eye-opener because I met kids who literally lived in central London, had two parents. I'd rocked up to school. My uniform my blazer was from Oxfam, and we kind of sewed on my, the emblem because I remember going to the school shop hoping to buy some uniform, and it was just so expensive. We couldn't afford the uniform that had the kind of the emblem sewn on. So we had to make ends meet. But it was interesting because I was around people who had a different level of privilege to me, but were also.
Was it a grammar school or just a?
It was just a public secondary school. But at the same time, we're very inclusive to my own lived experience, and I met many friends there who I still know today who have gone on to do some really amazing things.
Oh wow! So what was that like in terms of most people go to school close, especially secondary school, close to where they live, and then get sort of tied in with that sort of community of young people growing up. Was it important or pivotal for you to have broken that by going to school in a slightly geographically different place?
I think so. I mean, it taught me a lot. Firstly, just the resilience of waking up so early in the morning and heading to Liverpool Street Station, getting on the number 11 bus with my mum and sitting there for over an hour to get to school. Wow. It was quite the mission. And doing that every single day back and forth. So I think that was quite eye-opening. Being in an area like Victoria at the time was a very, very different kind of environment compared to Hackney, far more built up. There's a lot kind of happening, a lot going on. And again, just the school environment, I was in a school which is actually quite diverse. Many different communities there from across London. And that was interesting because I just learned more about different communities. So quite an interesting and unique experience for sure.
Yeah, I used to battle an hour to school as well. But it's amazing. It's amazing how you just get used to it, and that's what you do. You go to school and it takes you an hour to get there and an hour to get home, whereas for other people it takes them 10 minutes to get home from school.
And now I take my son to school who's 3.5, and that's about a 4-minute drive.
Or
a 15-minute walk in the summer.
So. It's quite incredible, and you're like, wow,
lucky.
Did I really do this for 7 years? Wow, but you kind of do. Was the school in Victoria more diverse than where you were living in Hackney?
It was a good representation of London, I would say.
Okay.
Because there were communities there who are from all different parts of London. It's hard to say whether it was more diverse, but I just remember seeing lots of black and brown kids in and around that environment. So.
Well, that's great, because often lots of people encounter schools that have been on this podcast where they are one of a minority in their schooling, and that kind of helps them sort of. Well, I don't think they do it at the time, but they get used to the idea of being in a minority. Sounds like you didn't really have that.
The difficulty I had is I identify as black by mixed race. So my mother's Sri Lankan. My father was Nigerian. And I was never really maybe black enough to be with the black kids or identify with black culture in that way. Certainly not brown enough. And visually, people wouldn't necessarily think that I'm half Asian. So I think that level of integration was quite difficult. And I ended up kind of thinking about, well, how do I just become a nondescript person? I don't know which culture I ultimately identify with at the time. And I would say different things. If anyone asked me, like, where are you from, the classic question, I'd say I'm Asian and African. And then after many years, I'd say I'm British or, I identify as black. It was quite hard to place myself.
And that must have been quite difficult, trying to be yourself, authentically yourself. Where did you end up? Because my kids are mixed race as well, so they're kind of like, oh, I'm just as much white as I am black, but they end up spending more time with the black kids because they are not white. Did that work out that way for you?
Yeah, certainly in school it did. Yeah, I think a lot of the kids that ended up being close friends were black. And over time, that friendship group opened up. But I think there was more of a resonance there because, we all generally looked the same.
Yes.
Except for the fact that, when I went home, I was going home to a very Sri Lankan household.
Yes.
Maybe my hair was a bit more curly than my peers. Certainly grew a lot faster than my peers. But there were some differences, but there were lots of synergies too, right?
Oh, wow. That's super interesting. And how do you think that prepared you for, like, future life, whether it's college, university, working life, how did that prepare you?
I think it demonstrated to me that there are people out there like me who are in a positive environment. I remember going to my friend who used to live in South London, and he grew up in a house. And I remember going to his house for the first time.
An actual house?
He lived in an actual house, not a flat. Yeah. And I remember going to his house for the first time and seeing that he had a pantry. He had spare food. I couldn't believe it. Like
What's that food in there?
There was a whole cupboard with like juice boxes and like lentils and beans. And it was the first time I'd ever actually seen, firstly, a house of this size, but secondly, that someone actually had spare food in their house. It was quite an eye-opener. But in a way, it was maybe somewhat inspirational to me in terms of maybe the type of environment that I could live in the future. It's quite hard to say whether I would ever get out of the environment I was in at the time, living in a council estate in Hackney. But I think anything is ultimately possible, right? When you see that kind of, when you experience those moments, I think it's quite heartening in some way.
Well, it's quite interesting because it becomes aspirational. You see that there's a whole thing in my mind about what you can aspire to being what you can see, really. So if you think, well, I can see a house with spare food and stuff, that's a possible thing. 100%. He's got it, maybe I can have it, right? Yeah. If you never see it, you never experience it, it's very hard for you to see outside the confines of what you're experiencing, especially as a young person.
I think it's an underserved point that it's really difficult to be what you can't see.
Yeah.
And if you're in an environment where representation is completely non-existent, you're almost forced to be a trailblazer. I don't think I've ever met anyone that actually wants to be a trailblazer unless they're trying to, accomplish a particular feat or record. I think a lot of the time people just want to be the best version of themselves.
Correct.
And a big part of that journey is being able to see yourself represented.
Yeah, to see, obviously, part of the reason we do this podcast. So thank you for that. But 100%, right? And there's got to be a way of showing the art of the possible to people, even if it's not in their everyday life, that you can be like this. I'm similar to you. I went to school with people whose parents achieved amazing things, and my dad studied accountancy and all that sort of thing, and it just made me able to know that was all possible. Yeah. Not even at a stretch. These were just attainable things, not like I have to be super lucky to get it. If I work hard and do this, I can achieve it. I mean, what did your mum want you to be? What did she want you to aspire to achieving?
I think she just wanted me to break out of the environment I was in. She would never say things like, you grow up to be a doctor or a technician or a particular industry. She didn't have a focus on a particular industry because I think her focus was very much survival. How do I bring money home? And it was less. She had less of a focus on like nurturing my own kind of career opportunities or the future. It was very much we need to huddle together as a family and just get this done. And one of the things I certainly loved were things like creativity. That was very close to my heart because the environment I was in, Hackney, as I got older, was the epicenter of creativity. It was the epicenter of arts and graphic design and lots of amazing things. Yeah. And I was definitely influenced by that. And that was also very aspirational for me growing up because I could see that, there were people here who were maybe quite artsy, but were living their truth, were really leaning into their own passion. And that was also really interesting to see.
So did that make you aspire to being in that sort of space? So not less so what your parents wanted or your mum wanted for you, but what you wanted for yourself?
I think it just helped to nurture my creative mind. I mean, I've got a fascination on being multi-skilled in many different ways. Creativity, I think, is right at the center of that. Learning different skills has definitely been right at the heart of my personal and professional journey. And coincidentally, it's also helped me to access more opportunities. You know, a commitment to learning and growing and learning and development has quite frankly changed my life.
Yeah. I mean, were there traits? So thinking about that's what you thought about when you were younger. Were there any particular traits that you had? So imagination sounds like one of them, creativity, as a child that have been important in your long-term journey. So things where your mum would have always been able to say, yeah, he was always tenacious, or he was always creative, or he's always dreaming, or, you know, traits you showed as a young kid that have stayed with you into your adult life.
I think two that really stand out. Resilience is most definitely the trait that has helped to guide my path and helped me to recognize that the problem in front of me 99% of the time, or at least 90% of the time, is surmountable. I think the second for me is that just vision of myself and that vision of the future. One of the films that I remember watching many years ago, actually my son is named after the protagonist, there's a film called Gattaca. And in
Science fiction film, right?
It's a science fiction film. I do love science fiction. And in that film, the main actor is trying to get up to space, but he's living in a world where genetically we can create children who are just better. You know, they're that genetically they're superior in some way, and he's not one of those children.
Right.
He's predetermined to die at 33 years old. He's predetermined to have a particular career, and he manages to go above all of those barriers and actually get into, you know, at the end of the movie, spoiler alert, you know, he gets into a rocket. He goes up
everyone.
He goes up to Titan, one of the moons of Jupiter, through many different barriers, and it's a really fascinating film. And I think moments like that, I remember growing up really leaning into those types of films because I felt like if I had this vision of myself of what's achievable, maybe one day it will be possible. And that was definitely, you know, that vision of myself was definitely a big part of, you know, how I kind of got to where I am now.
So that's super interesting, right? Because one of the things that I've been trying to do as part of this was decode people who've managed to achieve it and what traits they have. That's why I asked the question. And obviously resilience comes as number one, but self-confidence is also a second, well, you know, I think also almost the most foundational one. But you kind of expanded it to be just knowing yourself, but also having almost a vision of you breaking through barriers. It's almost like, I know I'm going to have to go through barriers to get to where I'm going, and I have to build the resilience to make sure that I can do that based on what you've just said there.
Yeah, and it's driven. It was driven for me. It was driven from fear first and foremost,
right?
But also curiosity.
Okay.
You know, fear because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to how to walk down a particular path, what skills I would need to develop. I just felt like there's something I need to do here. You know, I got to lean into optimism, lean into positivity, and maybe if I just focus on one particular thing long enough, maybe I'd get good at it. You know, that was maybe one particular way of looking at it. And the other is, I think, really focused on hope as well. Like, you know, surely there's a better future ahead, and I'm allowed to be hopeful. I mean, it sounds quite dystopian at such a young age, but I think when you've got so many barriers around you, there are only so many ways that you can kind of take your mind and take your thinking.
Yeah.
And watching films at that young age helped me to visualize a very different future.
Yeah.
And engaging with people who, you know, had better levels of privilege made it very tangible. So those two things together, I think, gave me hope that actually, you know, change was possible in some way.
And clearly you've got one of the third ones, which is growth mindset, right? Which is this, well, you described almost the definition of growth mindset. If I do something for long enough, I'll get good at it. Yeah, that is the definition of a growth mindset. And again, what I'm finding is people who've managed to break through barriers all have the same growth mindset, which is I might not be good at something to start with, but if I work hard enough and focus on it enough, eventually I will be, and that will always be undeniable.
And I think for me at the time, certainly in my early teens as well, my focus was, let me just try.
Yeah.
Even if it's scary, let me just try this thing.
Yeah.
Let me try and learn it and let me see what happens. Even if I fail, it's not going to feel great. And I never felt great if something didn't work out. You know, I remember trying to start, years ago, I tried to start a business called Real UK Talent. I think I was like 18 years old. And the premise of that was, the camera phone was becoming more popular. What if you could film, it's a bit like Pop Idol online.
Yeah.
So what if you could film yourself with your particular talent, upload it to a website? And I thought this was going to be the one.
Yeah.
This will be the website that will take over.
It's
and it was
Facebook,
before
right?
YouTube, actually. It was before
right,
YouTube.
before
so
YouTube.
I should have got investment.
So you were on the right track.
I was on the right track,
Yeah.
but didn't see it through. But it was moments like that. I think that when I think back to those moments, which were kind of somewhat entrepreneurial, at least I tried.
Yeah.
It didn't work out, but at least I tried, and I went with my gut, and ultimately, wasn't a success, but it was a step on the wrong way for sure.
Yeah, that again, sort of real growth mindset, and give it a go, see where we end up. It was quite entrepreneurial, clearly. We'll get back to that. Real UK talent. realuktalent.co.uk.
I don't think it's up on.
You've still got that website?
I don't I don't have that website
right,
anymore.
you should keep it.
I do have the business cards I created.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I used to do that. I used to go to shops and they're like, what's it? I need a business card for this. And I get these stacks of business cards, which I make to give one or two away, and the whole time I had them. But it kind of proved that I'd started a business because I had the business card. It's always quite cool. So thinking about that time, what are you thankful that your parents taught you or told you? Sorry, your mum told you that you lives with you today, but was sort of sage advice. You may not even listen to it at the time, but actually became something that you come to think, yeah, thank God they told me that.
I think the advice that has always sat with me is just, if there's something you want to do, just go and do it. That is something that my mum definitely kind of centered her advice on. That don't believe that there are any barriers. Just go for it. And I think that is something that has helped to guide my career, because I've just felt like if I don't know the skill, we are modular as human beings. I could learn something for a year or 2 years and get good at it. So I think that is the thing that has guided certainly a lot of my early decisions, that I'm just going to do it, essentially.
In fact, you were almost YouTube, and your mum was clearly almost Nike. Just do it, right?
Clearly. Should have bought shares at that time.
Yeah, should have just do it. But it's actually very freeing. My parents were very similar. In fact, my mum very similar. It's like you can achieve anything you put your mind to. I say it to everybody. And that's what I want young kids to know, and especially people of ethnically diverse background. If you put your mind to it, you can do it.
Yeah,
right? You can do it. And it's because it's limiting beliefs. Because what your mum's done, what my mum did, was almost immediately get rid of limiting beliefs. And limiting beliefs are one of the major thing that I think holds people back.
Yeah, I think it's a massive challenge. I mean, I think let's also acknowledge the existence of systemic barriers, which I know we'll get into.
Yeah.
Because I think in and amongst that self-belief, you are still faced with these kind of invisible barriers in order to achieve your best self. And I think another challenge, which really more intersects with your socioeconomic background, is being able to know your strengths.
Yeah.
Like, what are your strengths, and have you nurtured your strengths? I never got interview practice back in school.
No.
And these things do help you to get the leg up, right? So.
Yeah. No. I think, yeah. You couldn't be, I think I couldn't be more in agreement with you, but we'll go into the sort of systemic barriers a bit later. So, moving forward, you've done school. Did you go to university? Did you do?
Not at the time. I went to college, and then I started working full time at quite a young age. I was working in retail.
So what was your first proper job, and how did you get into it?
My first proper job was my first full time job was Ryman's the Stationer at Upper Street.
Oh, Ryman's still there.
It's still there. Is it still there? Yeah.
I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure if that one's still there, but Ryman still exists, right?
Ryman still exists. Yeah. I think I can still tell the thickness of paper just by holding it, which is that's 80 grams.
A real party trick, if ever I've heard one.
So I worked in retail for many years, and then I think my first corporate job was in property. So I worked in property for over a decade, in fact. And that guided a big part of my career. I learned so many skills. I met many friends, and that was, I think, my first kind of professional corporate job that grew me in many, many different ways, and also put me in a new kind of unusual environment. It was a bit like going to secondary school for the first time. Yeah, I was around people, less of a representative environment and industry.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say.
I was one of the few people of color, one of the few black men within that organization, or even within the industry. When I kind of encountered many people.
And how did that make? Because you've come from, so we end up with some people who start in that environment through school, secondary school, university. So they go into an environment, a working environment, where they're the only person of color, but they're used to it.
Yeah.
So you might, from what we've talked about, you'd have been less used to it. How was that?
It felt uncomfortable at times because I didn't know whether I had to code switch and be different versions of myself. Coming from Hackney and put into an environment where lots of people are just living in central London.
Yeah.
They've been to private school. They were far more capable in the workplace in terms of how they networked and how they navigated internal politics.
Yes.
I was just not used to that.
Yeah.
I was not used to self-promotion. I was not really focused on that. I was focused on I'm going to be the person that really works the hardest in this company and see if it takes me somewhere.
Yeah.
And that was my focus. Luckily, I had someone who Dom Scott, who you will know. Actually,
I know Dom, yes.
Who I worked for, who was, my manager at the time.
Oh, wow.
And that was really fortunate because I was working for someone who was also a black
Looked
man,
like you.
Who looked like me, who was also on that journey of growth and self-development. And, we're great friends today. And I think if it wasn't for Dom, it would have been even more challenging to navigate that environment. And it was amazing to know that, great, I'm working for a black leader.
Yeah.
He's my line manager. And how do we rise together? What does that look like, right?
Oh, so few people have that.
That's right.
That have that direct role models, someone to look up to, right in their business that they can.
I mean, literally my line manager, right?
Yeah.
Which was incredible, and I think I learned a lot from Dom, and hopefully there was one or two things he picked up from me over the years. But ultimately, just seeing that representation from the get go at such a young age, in my early 20s, was transformational. It made me feel like, great, if Dom rises to more senior positions, maybe I can do the same.
Yeah.
And he was the first person always to champion me and to champion my career, which, for me personally was transformational.
Yeah,
he was like the sponsor that people always need. Not the mentor. He was the sponsor.
Well, and in fact, that's part of the driving force for what I try to achieve with Elevate Colour, which is we need more people of colour in leadership roles, for the reason of that will attract more other people who will experience having their boss being a person of colour. That's
right.
Right, and that's how you develop a pipeline of talent.
Yeah,
rather than this whole thing you said about being trailblazers. It's very hard for people to constantly be the trailblazer.
It's not sustainable, and you burn yourself out.
Yeah,
I mean, during that time, I was working just insane out. I'd travel from east to west London every single day. It's kind of that same journey to school I was taking over an hour. But I'd aim to be the first person in the office. I was in the office at like 7 a.m.
Wow.
And I'd say good morning to the CEO, switch the lights on. I wouldn't go home until probably 8 o'clock.
Wow.
So I'm getting home at like 9 o'clock, and I'm doing that again every single day, time and time again. I was used to that level of resilience, but I think what I also didn't realize was that there was something driving that, and it was that fear again. It was that fear of not being successful. It was that fear of not fitting in. It was that fear of wanting to stand out. Maybe these are the things that I needed to do, not realizing that actually you can balance out hard work with smart work, and you can still achieve the same kind of outcomes, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. So, hard worker, driven by fear. What were the most significant steps, do you think, in your career to where you are now?
I think during that time, my first couple of promotions were very significant because it put me into positions of management and leadership. In retail, I got up to becoming a retail manager, and I think that was interesting. But when I worked in property, it gave me, I think, more tools, more opportunities. Financially, I was more better off. And then there were a couple of real inflection points for me. In 2015, I started working with Hackney Council to tackle unemployment with young black men. It was the highest in the country.
And how did you get into that?
That was a volunteer position. So they were looking for businesses, they were looking for organizations to club together to work on, how do we tackle this? Let's come together as focus groups. I remember recording videos for YouTube at the time because I felt like, look, I need to be more out there. I need to think about how I can inspire more people to, follow that same journey of resilience and learning.
Okay.
And that for me, framed why I need to be part of the solution as well.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't enough just to work in a senior position and be visible in some way, or even to mentor young people. Actually, I need to focus on, well, what can I do to change this? And I felt like in the workplace, we've got a really unique opportunity. If we create opportunities in the workplace for people of color and underrepresented people, it changes the very fabric of how that workplace operates. But it also creates a societal change, right? Because you start to see more representative leaders across the business. And hopefully that would inspire people to come through. So I then decided that, over the next few years, I'm going to pivot. I'm going to move away from my role and my career in property. I'm going to focus more on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and went on a really unique journey after that.
Did you even think of it as that? Did you just think? Because I'm not sure that label even existed back then as such, or did it?
It did. I mean, diversity, post-civil rights movement, but diversity was really the term that people used, which was focused on how do we integrate multicultural communities? How do we ensure that they feel included? Inclusion kind of then followed. Equity is obviously a big part in terms of like acknowledging that we don't have a true meritocracy. We need to level the playing field. But I think at the time, diversity and inclusion, or I&D, is probably another acronym that people would have used, during that period. It was still up in the air in terms of what that looked like.
Yeah.
And I think the big principles were really around women empowerment in the workplace.
Yeah.
But that in itself wasn't always intersectional. It didn't always focus on the different types of communities. When we think about women, the intersections and the intersectionality of women, I think, wasn't a core focus, certainly, during that would have been 2014 for me.
So what's also interesting to me is that a major pivot in your career comes from you doing something voluntary. And so, I often talk about the ability of people to make their own luck, get out there, do things that are different. Because if you just carried on your career track and then looked at voluntary, you would never have made this pivot, right?
Yeah.
You would never have made this pivot. But actually, you've had your eyes open to something new by being a self-starter, a proactive learner, that's really shaped your whole career and your life from then.
And funnily enough, I learned that skill during property, because one of the roles I had was literally being on the phone, making 200 phone calls a day, being tenacious enough to connect with people and, have a conversation.
You were one of those people? I'm really not interested, thank you.
Are you sure you don't want to sell?
No, I really don't. I really don't, thank you. And how did you get my number?
And therefore, I kind of went into those experiences thinking, well, you can touch base with someone, you can reach out to someone authentically. It led to me meeting Ali Owen, who started the Brixton Finishing School.
Do I know that you know her?
I don't know. I was her first head of mentorship, helped to develop that program at the time. And that was fascinating to me because Ali was trying to put together the Brixton Finishing School.
Yeah.
Felt like this could be a real enabler for underrepresented talent, specifically from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, to just get access to opportunity. And I wanted to be part of that, So at the time, I was like, great, how do I get involved and what do you need help with? And how can I help you kind of develop this program? And that was another inflection point for me that actually change is possible. I mean, seeing that first program come to life and seeing many of those young people actually get placed in companies like, McCann or Clear Channel.
Yeah.
I mean, when I see that first cohort and what they're doing now, it's incredible to see what they've kind of gone on to do.
Yeah.
So it goes to show that a lot is possible with the right interventions, with the right programs.
Yeah. No, what Ali does at Brixton Finishing School is inspirational. It's certainly inspired me to be doing what I'm doing now. So big up Ali.
Big up Ali Owen. Yeah, she's an amazing person.
You better be listening, Ali. Seriously,
I'll forward her this.
I'm going to call you after this session. Okay, so your career's going. You've pivoted. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't do that. I get all relaxed, but you've got to really be in front of the mic. You've pivoted to a different space. Talk to me about, we've talked about resilience. Any significant setbacks on this journey that you've been on? Any significant setbacks, and how did you deal with them? Just as an example of your resilience.
I think the first setback was actually trying to pivot was really difficult.
Yeah.
So actually trying to enter the space. I'd researched diversity, equity, and inclusion by that point for 2 years. I mean, I I was looking at globally what's happening with DE&I, what's effective, essentially, even before I got my own personal accreditation. But trying to bring that into a type of role was almost impossible, because during that period, the experience required was you needed some kind of HR background, or you needed to be working within an active HR role, and there wasn't an acknowledgement that actually you can bring different skills to DE&I. And what you need to really be thinking about was what's effective and what's working.
Yeah.
So that was challenging. I think navigating the whole, I worked for a startup before starting my own company.
Yeah.
Navigating that whole space with confidence was a challenge in itself. Even if you're resilient, you still have that sense of imposter syndrome of, do I belong here?
Yeah.
Can I achieve this? Can I see this through? Yes, I might have that vision of success and that vision of myself, but I still need to execute on that vision. And that was difficult and challenging, but I think, true to myself, I just felt like the worst thing that I'm going to do is fail.
Yeah.
So at very least, I need to try, and I need to think about, how do I get this off the ground, and how do I make sure that, I'm leading with integrity in terms of the work that I do, and what this future could look like.
Yeah. It's a classic, I think, mindset of entrepreneurs, which is, what's the worst that can happen? Right.
What's the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen is that you completely fail. Maybe you need to get a job in something that you're not passionate about, and you'll have to kind of try it again in years to come.
But you'll be enriched by the fact that you've tried.
Absolutely.
I think that's the difference between those people that are entrepreneurship. They know that I'll get something from trying and failing.
Yeah.
And we all know that failure is possibly the best lesson, actually, that you can have in how you do it differently the next time you go at it.
And I think you need to minimize how you fail, and you've really got to reflect on those failures as well. I think a lot of people fail and maybe just think, okay, I'm just going to bury that and move on, but just reflect on what's worked and what hasn't.
So as you consider your career to date, do you think that race, ethnicity has impacted? Clearly, you work in the space now, but it still may influence your career. So, to what degree do you think race, your ethnicity, has impacted your career?
I think the overriding feeling of exclusion has always been hard to stomach. Mm-hmm. Not knowing that the room I'm about to walk into, will I feel like I'm represented in some way? And that's purely based on obviously what you can see. Mm-hmm. There are other elements of obviously representation that are also important to me. But I think that in terms of race, I think that's always been a challenge. I think the other element is, will people see me and understand my cultural background? Mm-hmm. Will I be asked questions? Those microaggressions, we spoke about it briefly before the podcast. Those unintentional slights or snubs. Well, sometimes they cut deep. If you experience one or two of those every single day, maybe you'll be able to brush them off. But what if it's 10 or 15? It gets to a point where you genuinely feel excluded. You genuinely feel like you shouldn't be there.
How do we do? We'll go into but let's talk about the microaggressions in education, because I've had discussions where people say, that's not a big thing to think about. But I'm feeling, well, layer on layer on layer does impact your psyche and how you feel about yourself. What's your view on that and microaggressions specifically?
Microaggressions specifically, I think not only does it create an environment of exclusion, it also means that you're having to commit energy to ultimately decompress from a situation that you have not been the catalyst of. And often, microaggression is like that question of, where are you from?
Yeah.
There are lots of other things that we can discuss. There are lots of other things that we can talk about. If I meet you for the first time, and the very first question you ask me is, where are you from? Why that can be triggering is it's almost, you've seen me, let's say, if you do have sight, you've seen me and you felt like that's the first question you feel compelled to ask. And are there reasons behind that? Yeah. That's my first thought.
Yeah.
Is it because you feel like I don't belong here? That is the reason why you're asking that question. So I think it can be very damaging for mental health. It can be very damaging for creating a more inclusive environment. But ultimately, it's just the volume of microaggressions that some people need to deal with. Mm-hmm. I have a level of privilege. I'm a cisgendered man. There are many people, women in the workplace. The number one microaggression for women in the workplace is being spoken over. And that happens time and time again. So imagine you're experiencing that 7 or 8 times a day.
Yeah.
It takes its toll.
Yes. So what advice do you give to... So basically, you're having to manage this sort of what you call it overriding feeling of or not being included, and having to manage the feeling that might be represented by lots of different types of microaggressions and behaviours. How did you get over that? How did you? Because some people say just get over it, and to move forward, you do have to get over it. How did you, or how do you?
I think setting boundaries is really important. So if a boundary is crossed, I think it's okay to challenge someone. And maybe in the first instance, you call that person in, because unless something's intentional, it's probably driven by an unconscious bias in some way. So I think challenging a point is helpful, but you need to know where your boundaries are. I think secondly, communicating exactly what you need in the workplace. If I was joining a company, the very first thing I would say is, or share is, this is what I need to feel included in this environment. Right. It may not be there yet, but I want to be part of that conversation. So I think that's helpful. On the flip side, if you're the person who's putting the microaggressions out to the world and you may not know it, being comfortable with the uncomfortable conversation. So being comfortable with being challenged, and knowing that if someone's experienced, that it's Tuesday and it's the 10th microaggression of that week, they may not always compassionately and empathetically challenge you. Being okay with that, I think sometimes is really helpful, because it means that you're centering them and their discomfort versus your own.
Yeah. Yes. Because I sometimes wonder how much is inadvertent, and so is it best to educate, although a lot of people say it's not that person's job to educate people, but sometimes people just don't. So I'll give you an example, actually, one that seems to be recurring at the moment. So I don't know if there's an underlying theme to it, but this whole thing about colour blindness.
Right.
I don't know why, but I've encountered it in the last month 4, 5, 6 times. I don't see you as black.
That's right.
I don't. And people say
I
that.
don't see colour is another expression.
Look, I had it last week. The way we run our, because I talk to lots of corporates, the way I run my business is we don't see colour. Of course. Right? We see everybody as the same, and clearly that's not right, right? Well, it's not right, but my point is about unintentional, the people often saying that are unintentional. How is it best to deal with that?
In a future state of society, we would acknowledge that race is a social construct. Genetically, we're 99.9% the same. Yeah. Where we are now is we have to acknowledge what it ultimately means in terms of your experience in the workplace and in life in general. So yes, it's just melanin in my skin. Yep. It shouldn't be a big deal. We should be able to say things like, I don't see color, or I don't see you as black, can be quite triggering, because it's almost like, I don't see you as the person that you identify as. Yeah. So I would delineate between the two. I think if someone says I don't see color, I think what they're trying to say is I see human beings first, and these things aren't important to me. They're almost arbitrary. Saying something like I don't see someone as black is almost melting away their lived experience and almost not acknowledging what's important to them. And I'm not shaming that person or any person that says that, but I think it's acknowledging that there are differences there. I don't think there's a real way to acknowledge this other than accepting that it is really tricky. It is really tricky, and I think there's a level of there's a cultural intelligence gap that needs to be plugged, and a big part of that is learning about communities that you don't identify with. What are their experiences in life, in the workplace, in society as a whole? Then you probably would avoid saying things like I don't see color, because you have to see the color of my skin to understand the barriers that I may face.
And it's just not true, right? There isn't, if you can see, there isn't a person who can see who can't see that person is a different color to that person.
Right.
It's just not true.
Yeah, I mean, there's that, exactly. I mean, there's that, but there's also, I think, what's behind that.
Exactly.
Am I acknowledging what's behind that? Chances are that I'm not. So I think that's the kind of the reflection that we need to have. When we say things like I don't see color, you're almost saying I don't see you as a person, and I don't see the things that you might be up against every single day.
And what's really interesting in the conversation that I had last week, the person was sort of saying, well, the group were asking me, like I'm an expert, about distance travel. I talk about distance travel. So I said, when you identify someone is from a different ethnic minority, you makes you start to understand they may have had a different background to someone who isn't, which gives you a different angle on them. And when we were talking about in the context of an interview, and that might give you a different view of their distance travelled.
Yeah.
You know, so 3 people might be sitting in front of you, but their distance travelled to get there in terms of what they've experienced is important about what they can achieve in their future. And if you actually recognise that, actually you might come to a different outcome to where they might get to in the future.
Yeah, and I think there's also the conversation of unearned advantages, right? You know,
Correct.
What we kind of would frame as privilege. Like, what level of privilege have you had on that journey, and how has that positively influenced the outcomes that you've managed to access? You know, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that there are people of color and black people who have high levels of privilege, and there are people that don't, and often that's not to be shamed. You know, when I think about my son's mixed raced.
Yep.
And he's got, you know, there's nothing that he wants for. So I'm very thankful to be able to create that life for him. And at the same time, it's important when he grows up, he acknowledges the differences that he has versus other kids in the world.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. So we're into the work, right? We're into the work, and one of the things that I think about an awful lot is institutional racism. I kind of think for organisations, this is one of the biggest issues we have today in society. Yeah. What if you agree it exists? Why does it exist, and how do we address it?
Well, institutional systemic racism is everywhere. It exists because racism is on a spectrum. I think sometimes when people think about racism, they think it's kind of the most insidious events in society. You know, it's only confined to things like, you know, the murder of George Floyd.
Yeah.
Realistically, racism is linked to microaggressions. You know, racism is linked to unconscious bias. It's linked to the systems and structures that would influence, you know, how black women are treated in the health system, all the way through to, you know, how young kids of color are, you know, looked at within schooling. You know, there are many different barriers that can be faced because of racism, and institutional racism is an acknowledgement that it is baked into our structures and systems in some way. It's undeniable. Why people deny it is because of that. I think that uncomfortable conversation that that indicates or insinuates that I may be racist as an individual in some way, and I think that's really hard for people to discuss. You know, let alone
or to accept, or
let alone acknowledge.
Yes.
I don't think anyone's exempt from it, though, because even black or people of color
100%
would also have internalized racism.
Absolutely.
And they'll, you know, and that can impact how communities integrate all the way through to the types of decisions they may make.
Yeah, no, 100%. So, and I know that, you know, I'm my parents are Nigerian descent, but Yoruba people and Igbo people, they don't always get on, you know. So it can be tribal. There's lots of people, lots of reasons why people don't like other people. So that's on one state, but the whole institutional thing is the reality is almost like invisible, you know, and it's the opportunities that you don't get, and the promotions that you probably didn't get, you know, and all of that sort of thing. So we kind of notice that, you know, you've thought and studied this a lot. How best to address it?
I think firstly, going back to uncomfortable conversations. In the workplace, we have to create an environment of psychological safety, because the principles of psychological safety is, you know, can I show up as I am? Can I challenge the status quo? Can I speak my truth without shame or discomfort? Am I acknowledged for my perspective? So what that means for me as a black person or person of color coming into the workplace is I can talk about my experiences. I can challenge, you know, structures and systems that exist in the workplace without being shut down, without being gaslit, without being ignored. I think many organizations, in the absence of psychological safety, the first response when it comes to talking about institutional racism or any kind of ism in the workplace is to contain it, right? Like, let's contain that conversation Some leaders, maybe their first response will be to ignore it, or to disregard
or defend
the
it,
existence
or deny it,
or defend it, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's important that we create an environment where we can challenge and speak up. There is no silver bullet, because this is where what happens in the workplace has an intrinsic link to how society operates. So if we were to acknowledge that it isn't a level playing field, what we'd also need to acknowledge is the importance of creating equitable systems and structures. And that equity and the building of equity, it spans many, many different lived experiences. So, institutional racism is one thing. If that intersects with your socioeconomic background, if that intersects with having a disability, you'll find that your chances in the workplace of getting into, let's say, senior leadership positions, they get slimmer and slimmer, based on that layer cake of lived experiences that ultimately make you who you are.
Yeah.
So I think there's no easy way to solve it. I think it starts with the acknowledgement of its existence.
Yeah. And that's hard in itself, right?
That's hard in itself, because we often say things like we have a true meritocracy.
Yes.
If you work hard, you can get to a certain position in life. In many companies these days, that can be true. That actually, irrespective of who you are and how you identify, you can get into senior positions. And I think that's really great to see. However, take the Pareto principle. It's probably 20% or even less of companies that would actually have an environment and inclusive culture that is equitable enough that anyone would be able to kind of get into those same senior positions. I think that's a challenge that we're still grappled with.
So do you? One of the things I'm thinking about is that the meritocracy argument, which I make as a senior leader, a CEO, CEO, is actually sometimes unhelpful, because it's seen as almost a denying principle. Yeah, this is all right, but we just give the best person for the job. And if that ends up being 10 white males, then that's just how it is. How do you look at that?
Well, I think data is really important. I mean, look, I think there are many different ways to look at it. I think firstly, if we were to, let's say, analyze day-to-day interactions, we could look at within a meeting, whether it's virtual or in person, who gets a chance to speak up and who gets a chance to contribute in a meaningful way. If I'm a leader, who do I allocate stretch projects to? So when I know that there's a particular project that's coming up that will require someone's involvement, and maybe it's not their day-to-day kind of to-do list, but it will give them an opportunity to learn and grow, I may just choose that favorite person in the workplace who I also happen to identify with.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily a reflection that many leaders will stop and think about. So there is those types of things in terms of interactions, but then let's get a bit more granular. Who's getting interviewed? The NFL, the reason why the NFL integrated the Rooney Rule is because there were no black coaches. So let's ensure that our shortlists are made up and comprised of at least a percentage of underrepresented people. And that's quite significant. If we were to say that in every single company in the FTSE 100 now, when we're interviewing for a senior leadership position, 50% of that shortlist needs to be made up of underrepresented candidates, and half of that we need to know that they are black or brown communities. That would change over time. That would change the very fabric of senior leadership, across our country. That in itself isn't a finite solution, though, because there are many different aspects to that we need to take into account. But I think having a robust strategy, really looking at the data behind that, will help to, I think, dispel any myths or assumptions that we may make around the existence of meritocracy or the existence of an equitable structure.
I agree. And one of the things I say to people is, what's best, right? The best person for the job actually needs to be seen in the whole context of the organisation. Right. Not just the hardest. That used to mean the hardest work, the most brilliant person, the highest IQ. But really, is that what it means? If you've got a team that's very unbalanced, the best person for the job may be someone that's completely different to the people in the team. That's best in that instance. So people should think about what they mean by best in the environment that they're going to, because every environment is different, and needs different things. Yeah,
and affirmative action is obviously under attack right now. The US Supreme Court has repealed affirmative action, which has many colleagues in the US can't talk about how do we actively promote underrepresented candidates into a particular position. Very different from positive discrimination. Positive discrimination is where we say, we will only put this type of person into that position. And I think separating and delineating the two is important, because I think affirmative action is a good thing, and it's positive for us to be able to promote and acknowledge why, a meritocracy doesn't exist until we have a true level playing field.
Yeah. No. We could talk about that a lot more, but we're kind of running short of time. I'm conscious of time. So I always finish by asking the same question. This is very apt for you. We always, when we get into this bit about the work, we get into a sort of, we need to do this, we need to do this, we need to do this. But, I like hope. I like joy and hope. Like, why should we be hopeful, Frank?
I think we should be hopeful because there are many people who are on this mission of creating a more equitable workplace and society who are not relenting from that work. I think change is possible when we collaborate, and I think we should acknowledge that we've come a long way. There's an element of celebrating the journey of kind of where we are now, but knowing that there's so much more work to do.
Yeah, so it's the people doing the work that are important. And just a postscript to that, the role of allyship in achieving that. What's your view on that?
I think allyship is showing up for communities that you don't identify with, and choosing that as almost like a way of working. I think a really great and effective way to drive allyship is acknowledging, do you have a perception gap within your business? Interestingly, and I'll mention this quickly, 68% of leaders believe they're creating an empowering and inclusive culture.
Wow.
Only 36% of employees actually agree with that.
Yeah.
So allyship in that instance is, firstly, let's get that data. Let's acknowledge that there is a gap of experiences. And then secondly, what do we do to change that? How do we close that perception gap? And what are the principles behind that perception gap? Is it access to stretch opportunities, or is it even something like microaggressions? Because most leaders may think that actually our workplace doesn't contain microaggressions. Well, let's run a survey to identify whether that is actually the case. So allyship, I think, is really significant and gives us an opportunity to, I think, change the fabric and dynamic of what an inclusive culture needs to look like.
Yeah. Basically, everyone has a role to play in this, whether you're black, brown, white. In moving us forward, everyone has a role to play. Yeah. In fact, if everyone doesn't play a role, it will never move enough to make the change. Is how we see things.
We won't, and I think big. There are many barriers that exist right now for many communities, and there's a pyramid of privilege associated with that. But in the ways that we can influence, I think it's really important that we're part of the conversation. We think about tangible actions. We measure progress. I think that consistently over time can really drive things forward.
Brilliant. Well, look, thanks, Frank. As always, a totally enlightening conversation. You make so many incredibly informed points from your experience and your expertise. I know that I've benefited from that in the past, which is great. That's why I'm so keen to have you on this podcast. So thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing your views and your life and your history with us. It's much appreciated, and I think it could definitely inspire many other people.
No, great to be here. Thanks for having me on the show. Okay.
No problem. Thanks. Good. We are done.
Awesome.
We are done. Thank you. That was,
oh
man, I so need to catch up with you properly. We should. I'd love to tell you more about what's going on, and I'm sure you can give me some advice, because basically I don't know what I'm doing, and I love not knowing what I'm doing.
Yeah. It's green space to create and build.
Anyone who knows me, and all those people at Many Pets, know that I'm at my most dangerous when I haven't got a clue what I'm doing.
Yeah,
right?
Love that.
Because I'm making it up as I go along. I once had a client who said to me, "Okay, that sounds like you're just making this stuff as you go along." And I said to her, "I am." But isn't that what we're supposed to be doing?
Yeah.
If I was just doing what I've always done before, then you wouldn't be getting the full benefit of what's coming out of here.
Yeah, totally.
I'm just making it up as I go along.
Yeah.
But hopefully, through trial and error, we're going to get to the right sort of place. And, so many things and opportunities that are coming up at the moment, which is amazing. I don't know which ones to do, which ones not to do. And but back to you. What did you say? The business of one? What did you call it?
Company of One.
Company of One.
Paul Jarvis.
because
that's a really great book.
Because that's me. I always say, when I had my last business, which was me and loads of associates, people's like, "Why you can build this into the?" I'm like, I just don't want that. Right?
Yeah,
I really just don't want that because I've managed thousands of people. I know what that feels like. I love it.
Yeah,
you know.
exactly, yeah.
So let alone it being my own business with tens or hundreds of people, just fills me with fear.
Yeah.
You know, managing my own time is hard enough, let alone managing other people. So yeah, I'm definitely a company of one. But if you want to have impact, you've got to think, well, how can my company of one have the greatest impact, especially in the space that we work in?
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, it's very possible if we were to have this filter of impact over volume, that changes everything, because that means that anything we go into, it's focused on how do we create the most impact as a premise, right, as a foundation. And I think that is at this moment, you know, what we might call a DE&I winter, if you will. Is only momentary. I mean, it's only momentary because, you know, DE&I can't go away, right? It's always going to exist as a pillar and as a tenant. It will shapeshift over time.
Correct.
And that's fine. But I think there's it's still a problem to solve, and therefore we need solutions for it.
Yeah, no, I fully agree.